Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tuesday's reflection in Holy Week. Tuesday is an interesting day in Mark's Gospel regarding Jesus. Most of it is taken up with teaching, and about 2/3 of that is vigorous debate with the temple authorities, and they certainly cover some heavy and serious stuff. But as I was reading through it to pick a topic for today, I was struck by one little section. Let me read it. And it's Mark chapter 12, beginning verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few pence. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of all their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on." Amen. What a powerful little story, a little incident in the midst of all the heavy and serious theological debate. Something catches Jesus' eye, and he watches this, and he's touched by it. He's inspired by it, and of course not one to miss a lesson. He uses it to instruct the disciples. And the simplicity yet profundity of this story is in stark contrast to the heavy material roundabout, where he's debating theological issues with the scribes and the Pharisees in the temple. And it gets to the heart of our faith, the meaning of worship, the meaning of discipleship, the meaning of serving our Lord. And I want to tie it in with the example of someone who lived in Victorian times. Charles Thomas Studd, the famous C.T. Studd, one of the great missionaries, if not the greatest missionary that Britain ever produced. He was born in 1860 and he died in 1931. But my goodness, what a career he had. He was a famous cricketer in his day. He would be like the David Beckham of cricket in Victorian times. His father was very, very wealthy indeed. So he came from a wealthy family, and Charles was educated at Eton and then at Cambridge. So that's what we're dealing with here. His father actually became a Christian because of D.L. Moody, the famous American evangelist, came over in the second half of the 19th century on an evangelistic crusade in Britain. And C.T. Studd's father was converted through that. So that meant there was a Christian input into the family. So C.T. Studd was very much aware of what the gospel was about. But it wasn't until one of his brothers had a serious illness that he was challenged about where he stood. And interestingly, that was a turning point for him, because it reflecting on his fame as a great Victorian sportsman, he realised what is fame and flattery when a person comes to face eternity. That's what he said. What is fame and flattery when a person comes to face eternity? And that was a turning point for him. And he renewed his faith, gave his life to Christ, and he gave up cricket to go to the mission field. Now, he was one of the famous Cambridge 7. You've maybe heard of the Cambridge 5. That's the Cambridge graduates who all became communist sympathisers, and some of them spied for the Russians during the Second World War and into the 50s and even the 60s. So you maybe heard of them because there have been documentaries about them and films, dramas about them too. But the Cambridge Seven were Christians from well-to-do families who educated at Cambridge, who all went off to China to the mission field. Queen Victoria was very impressed by their story, and there's a famous picture of the 7 of them all dressed in Chinese clothing, all going out to the mission field, and C.T. Studd was one. When he was in China, his father died, and he inherited an incredible amount of wealth. In today's terms, it would be £3 million. £3 million. He gave it all away. That was his share. Obviously, the rest of the family got something else. But his share was £3 million. And he gave it all away to charities, Christian charities, working with the poor, because he'd given his life to Christ. After China, he worked as a missionary in India and also in Africa. And Africa was where he died, in the Congo in 1931. A great influential missionary. His legacy was unfathomable because of the amount of people that he inspired. And yet, not long before he died, one of his daughters visited him, and knowing that he didn't have long, and that by the time, this is the 1930s, the boat trip back to Britain, the chances of her seeing him again were very remote. And as she was leaving to go back to Britain, he looked around his room to find something he could give her as a wee memento, so that she could hold on to that and remember him. It was her father's. But he couldn't find anything. And he apologised. He said, "I'm sorry, I have nothing to give you. I gave it all away to Christ all those years ago." What a life of faith and discipleship. Coming from an incredibly wealthy background, being a sports superstar, and he gave it up. He became, in Paul's words, a fool for Christ. And that was one of the headlines in the Victorian newspapers. This guy, C.T. Studd, a fool for Christ's sake. And of course, there's two ways you can look at that. Literally in the sense of Paul's approach, or if you were wanting to be contemptuous of it, dismissive of it, you could read it another way. But C.T. Studd gave up everything to serve Christ in China, in India, and in Africa. And Jesus saw in this wee woman in the temple, not making a big song and dance, she was just a simple wee wifey, and she was bringing her 2 wee copper coins to give as an offering. And Jesus was touched and moved by that, because it didn't amount to much, because there's other people coming in and giving lots of money, lots of show and ostentation about how devout they were. But this wee woman gave so much. She gave everything. And Jesus was touched by that, because he was about to do the same. And that's what he did. He gave everything for us. And he calls us to be his disciples. And not just his example, but thank God for the example of faithful men and women throughout history who give inspiring examples to us of what real faith means. Now, we can't all be like C.T. Studd. We're not called to be. His was a specific calling. It wouldn't work if everybody was like C.T. Studd. We all have a role to play. But what we have to ask ourselves is what we have, not just financially, but materially and in every other way, do we see that as God's blessing to us? Are we challenged about how we use what we have, and including our time and our talents? Are we prepared to give more to the one who called us. He gave everything for us. He asks us to follow him. And that's challenging. So this Easter, let's think about that. We owe so much to this God who loves us so much. And inspired by this wee wifey who gave all that she had to the God that she worshipped. Inspired by C.T. Studd, who went the extra mile in his discipleship and devotion. Maybe somewhere in between there we can make a start to say, okay, right, Lord, what am I going to do today and this week? Am I grateful and thankful for all that I have? Am I grateful and thankful for what you've done for me? And what can I give? What can I do? What a challenge. All from a little story. A little incident. A wee wifey that Jesus spotted and used as this wonderful illustration for us. And you know what? As I read this section in Mark with the big teaching, this little gem shines out because it speaks to things of the heart. But are we listening? Well, let's hope so. Thank you for watching. God be with you. See you tomorrow.